Keanu Reeves sat quietly in the corner of a cozy Los Angeles cafe, sipping his coffee and flipping through a worn paperback. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, bathing the room in a warm golden glow. To most, he was just another patron, enjoying a rare moment of solitude. But the peaceful rhythm of the cafe shattered as the door swung open with force. A man burst in, his expression taut with anger, his eyes locking onto Keanu. Without hesitation, he marched forward, his voice cutting through the hum of conversation. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" The room fell silent, every gaze shifting toward the confrontation. Keanu looked up calmly, his book now resting on the table. What happened next was not what anyone expected. It was a moment that would challenge assumptions, reveal hidden truths, and remind everyone present of the quiet power of empathy. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow, we have another inspiring story just for you. It was a warm afternoon in Los Angeles, and the small corner cafe bustled with life. The gentle hum of conversation mixed with the soft hiss of an espresso machine, creating a backdrop of comforting noise. The sunlight filtered through large windows, casting golden beams onto the hardwood floors. Patrons sat at mismatched tables, their chatter punctuated by the occasional clink of ceramic mugs and spoons. Outside, the faint rumble of traffic added a distant rhythm to the lively scene. In one corner, near a window streaked with afternoon light, sat Keanu Reeves. Dressed in a simple black t-shirt and faded jeans, he exuded an effortless humility that made him blend into the crowd. A worn leather backpack rested at his feet, and in his hands was a well-thumbed paperback book. His long hair fell slightly over his face as he read, his features calm and focused. To the casual observer, he could have been anyone, just another quiet soul savoring a moment of peace in a busy city. But for those who recognized him, it was a surreal sight. A Hollywood star seated alone in a modest cafe, reading as if the world outside didn't know his name. Yet there he was, appearing entirely at ease, completely detached from the glamour and chaos often associated with his fame. He took a sip of his cappuccino, its frothy foam leaving a faint mark on the rim of the cup. It was a rare moment of tranquility, and Keanu seemed intent on savoring every second. The cafe itself was a haven for those seeking respite from the city's rush. College students hunched over laptops, their faces illuminated by screens. Friends leaned in close over shared pastries, their laughter spilling into the air. A barista with a tattoo sleeve expertly maneuvered behind the counter, crafting beverages with a practiced flair. The smell of freshly ground coffee mingled with hints of vanilla and cinnamon, wrapping around everyone like a comforting embrace. Keanu's table was deliberately chosen. It was tucked away near a bookshelf crammed with an eclectic mix of novels and magazines, offering just enough privacy without making him seem unapproachable. He occasionally glanced up from his book, observing the subtle dance of everyday life around him. A young woman at the table next to him sketched in a notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. Across the room, a child giggled as his father playfully juggled sugar packets. These small, human moments seemed to ground him, bringing a faint smile to his lips. Despite the casual anonymity, a few patrons had noticed him. Whispers traveled between tables, eyes darting in his direction. "Is that?" one young man murmured to his friend, who nodded subtly, trying not to stare. But Keanu remained undisturbed, his demeanor radiating an unspoken boundary that dissuaded interruptions. The barista, who had undoubtedly recognized him, glanced his way occasionally but made no move to disturb his solitude. The unspoken rule of the cafe was clear. This was a space for quiet reflection, not spectacle. Outside, the golden hour bathed the streets in a warm glow. Pedestrians moved with unhurried steps, their faces softened by the light. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of nearby trees, carrying with it the faint scent of jasmine from a flower stand down the block. Everything about the scene felt serene, as if the universe had conspired to create this pocket of peace in the middle of the city's ceaseless energy. Keanu turned a page, his eyes scanning the lines of text with quiet absorption. He seemed lost in the world of the book, his expression thoughtful. Occasionally, he'd pause to take another sip of his coffee or adjust his position in the chair. The simplicity of the moment was almost poetic. A man often associated with larger-than-life roles, now living a scene of quiet introspection. Yet, beneath the calm exterior, there was an undercurrent of anticipation. Perhaps it was the way the conversations occasionally dipped, the way a few heads turned his way as if drawn by some invisible force, or maybe it was the subtle tension in the air, a prelude to something yet to come. But for now, the cafe hummed on, oblivious to the story that was about to unfold. A story that would leave everyone questioning their assumptions and perspectives. Keanu's fingers lightly tapped the edge of his book, a faint rhythm against the paper. The moment was fragile, as if a single disturbance could shatter it. And in a way, it was. For while the cafe's charm lay in its routine, the small, predictable joys of daily life, fate had a way of introducing the unexpected. The harmony of the afternoon was about to be disrupted. And no one in the room, least of all Keanu, could foresee how profoundly it would change everything. The disturbance came in the form of a voice, sharp and laden with tension. "You think you're better than us, huh?" The words cut through the cafe's ambient noise, loud enough to make heads turn and conversations falter. Keanu's gaze lifted from his book, his calm eyes searching for the source of the interruption. Standing a few feet away from his table was a man in his late 40s. His face was weathered, the kind that spoke of sleepless nights and countless worries. His clothes, though not shabby, carried the unmistakable wear of someone who'd faced hard times. His posture was rigid, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He stared at Keanu with a mix of anger and desperation, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The cafe grew quieter still, the murmurs and clinking of cups replaced by a charged silence. The barista froze mid-pour, her eyes darting nervously toward the confrontation. Patrons exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of whether to intervene or stay out of it. The tension in the air was palpable, a thick, invisible force that seemed to hold everyone in place. "Yeah, you think you can just sit here, reading your fancy book, drinking your fancy coffee, like the rest of us don't exist?" The man's voice was raw, each word dripping with bitterness. His eyes burned with an intensity that made even those sitting far away feel uncomfortable. Keanu didn't react immediately. He closed his book with deliberate calm, placing it gently on the table. His movements were slow, measured, as if refusing to escalate the situation. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice soft but clear. "Have I done something to upset you?" The man let out a harsh laugh, a sound devoid of humor. "Upset me? You people always act like you don't know, like you don't see us." He gestured broadly, his arm sweeping across the room as if to encompass everyone present. "People like me? We're invisible to you." The words landed heavily in the room, eliciting a ripple of unease among the patrons. A woman near the counter shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze fixed on her coffee cup. The barista's hand hovered near the phone, her expression torn between concern and indecision. Keanu, however, remained composed. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture open but non-threatening. "I don't think you're invisible," he said, his tone steady. "I see you." The simplicity of the statement seemed to disarm the man, if only for a moment. His shoulders tensed, his expression flickering between anger and something more fragile, but the anger won out. "Don't patronize me," he spat. "You don't know anything about me, about what it's like to struggle." "You're right," Keanu replied. "I don't know your story, but I'd like to, if you're willing to share it." The man blinked, clearly caught off guard by the response. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, as if unsure of what to say. Around them, the cafe remained silent, the air thick with anticipation. It was as though everyone present was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Finally, the man took a step closer to Keanu's table. "You really want to know?" he asked, his voice quieter now but no less intense. "Fine, let's talk." Keanu gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Please," he said, his invitation as sincere as his gaze. The man hesitated for a moment longer, then pulled out the chair and sat down. His movements were jerky, his tension evident in every motion. The cafe once again seemed to exhale collectively as the confrontation shifted into something more unexpected. The tension in the air didn't dissipate entirely as the man sat down across from Keanu. His movements were stiff, his body language guarded. He leaned back in the chair, crossing his arms tightly over his chest, as if bracing for a confrontation. Keanu, in contrast, remained calm and open, his hands resting lightly on the table. Around them, the cafe's patrons pretended to return to their own business, but their glances betrayed their curiosity. The atmosphere was electric, charged with unspoken questions and anticipation. The man cleared his throat, his expression still hard. "You want to hear my story?" he said, his voice carrying a sharp edge. "Fine, but don't think this is going to make you feel good about yourself." Keanu nodded, his gaze steady. "I'm not here for that. I'm just here to listen." The simplicity of the response seemed to momentarily disarm the man, but he quickly shook it off. He exhaled sharply, as if gathering his thoughts, then began to speak. "I used to work construction," he said, his voice quieter now but no less intense. "It was hard work, yeah, but it was honest. Built things people needed. Houses, schools, bridges, stuff that mattered. Then one day, the company I worked for decides it's cheaper to bring in contractors from overseas. Just like that, me and my crew, guys who'd been there for years, were out on the street." His fingers tapped an erratic rhythm on the table, the only sign of his growing agitation. Keanu didn't interrupt, giving the man the space to continue. "At first, I thought I'd bounce back," the man went on. "Thought I'd find something else. I've always been a hard worker, you know? But it wasn't that easy. Everywhere I went, they either didn't want to hire someone my age or wanted to pay me half of what I was worth. And the bills, they don't wait for you to figure it out." His voice cracked slightly on the last sentence, and he looked away, his jaw tightening. For a moment, it seemed like he might stop, but Keanu leaned forward slightly, his quiet presence encouraging the man to keep going. "My wife tried to hold it together," he said, his eyes fixed on a spot on the table. "She really did. But after a year of scraping by on odd jobs and charity, she couldn't take it anymore. She left, took the kids, said she needed to give them a better chance. I can't even blame her for that. What kind of life was I giving them?" A heavy silence settled over the table. The man's bitterness was now tinged with something deeper. Regret, sorrow, a profound sense of loss. Keanu nodded slowly, his expression one of quiet empathy. "Being invigorated calm, that must have been incredibly hard," he said gently. "Losing them like that." The man's eyes snapped up, narrowing. "You don't get it," he said harshly. "You've got everything. Money, fame, whatever you want, it's yours. How could you possibly understand what it's like to have nothing?" Keanu took a breath, his calm demeanor unwavering. "You're right," he said. "I've been fortunate in many ways, but that doesn't mean I haven't experienced loss or pain." The man scoffed, clearly unconvinced. "Oh yeah? What could someone like you possibly know about pain?" Keanu hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. Then, his voice low and steady, he said, "I've lost people I loved. My best friend, my partner, my child. Grief doesn't care how much money you have or what your name is, it finds you just the same." The cafe, which had been filled with the soft hum of resumed conversations, fell silent again. Even the barista paused mid-mater, her tray of mugs momentarily forgotten. The weight of Keanu's words seemed to ripple outward, touching everyone who heard them. The man stared at him, his hostility faltering. For the first time since the confrontation began, there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or the faintest trace of understanding. "You really lost a kid?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu nodded. "A long time ago, but some things, they never leave you." The man's posture softened, his crossed arms lowering slightly. He let out a breath, his anger draining away like air from a balloon. "I'm sorry," he muttered, almost to himself. "I didn't know." Keanu offered a small, empathetic smile. "There's no need to apologize. We all carry things no one else can see. Sometimes they make us act in ways we don't expect." The man shook his head, running a hand through his graying hair. "I came in here ready to pick a fight," he admitted. I thought you'd just brush me off, make me feel small, but you didn't. That's because you're not small, Keanu said. Your story matters, and I think you're stronger than you realize. The man blinked, as if the words had struck a chord deep within him. For a long moment he was silent, his eyes downcast. Then, finally, he looked up, and for the first time, his expression was free of anger. Thanks, he said, his voice rough but sincere. For listening, for not judging me. Keanu nodded. Thank you for sharing. It takes courage to be that honest. The cafe, still holding its collective breath, seemed to exhale all at once. Conversations resumed, though softer now, as if everyone was processing what they had just witnessed. The man leaned back in his chair, visibly lighter than he had been when he walked in. Across the table, Keanu remained calm and grounded, his presence radiating quiet. For the first time, the man smiled. A small, hesitant thing, but genuine. Maybe it's not all as hopeless as it feels, he said. Maybe not, Keanu agreed. Sometimes, it just takes a moment like this to remind us. And in that moment, the cafe seemed to shift. Strangers exchanged glances that felt less distant, the walls of the room holding not just people, but a shared sense of humanity. Keanu sat back in his chair, allowing the man the space to reflect. But he knew something important had happened, not just for the man, but for everyone who had been there to witness it. The cafe was no longer just a room filled with strangers. It had become a quiet stage, each patron a member of an audience, drawn into the raw humanity of the unfolding moment. The man across from Keanu leaned forward now, his posture no longer defensive but tentative, as though he were testing unfamiliar waters. His voice, stripped of its earlier anger, carried a new note, curiosity. You really believe that? The man asked, his gaze locked onto Keanu's. That it's possible to move past all this? That I can still turn things around? Keanu didn't respond immediately. He allowed the silence to stretch, letting the man's question hang in the air like a fragile thread. Finally, he nodded, his expression thoughtful. I think it's possible, he said softly. But it's not easy. It takes time, and sometimes it feels impossible. But I also think we're stronger than we give ourselves credit for. The man leaned back, his arms resting on the table now instead of crossed defensively over his chest. You make it sound simple, he muttered, though his tone lacked the edge it once carried. It's not simple, Keanu replied, his voice steady. But it starts with small steps, like this conversation, like allowing yourself to be honest about what hurts. The man looked down at his hands, his fingers tracing the lines of the worn wooden table. I don't even know where to begin, he admitted, his voice barely audible. I've been angry for so long. At everything, at everyone. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. Maybe start with yourself, he said. Not with blame, but with forgiveness. The man looked up sharply, as if the word had startled him. Forgiveness? He repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. For what? For being human, Keanu said simply. For not having all the answers. For making mistakes. We all carry things we wish we'd done differently. But holding on to that weight, it only makes it harder to move forward. The words settled over the table like a blanket of quiet understanding. The man's expression shifted, his features softening as he processed what Keanu had said. Around them, the cafe hummed with the low murmur of resumed conversations, but the space between them felt insulated, as if they were the only two people in the room. I've spent so much time blaming other people, the man said finally. Blaming the system, my boss, my ex-wife, blaming guys like you. He looked up, his eyes meeting Keanu's with a flicker of shame. But maybe I've been avoiding looking at myself. Maybe it's easier to be angry than to face all the ways I've screwed up. Keanu's expression didn't change, his empathy unwavering. Anger's a powerful thing, he said. It makes us feel like we're in control even when we're not. But it can also blind us to what's really important. The man nodded slowly, his gaze dropping back to the table. For a long moment he said nothing, his fingers still tracing absent patterns on the wood. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost hesitant. You know, I used to dream about being someone people could look up to, he said. When I worked construction, I thought if I worked hard enough, saved enough, I could give my kids a life I never had. But now, he trailed off, shaking his head. Now, I don't even know what they think of me. Keanu's voice was gentle when he replied, "Maybe you don't have to be perfect for them to look up to you. Maybe it's enough to keep trying." The man's eyes flicked up, searching Keanu's face for something. Judgment? Pity, perhaps? But finding only sincerity. He exhaled sharply, a sound that was half laugh, half sigh. "You make it sound so damn simple," he said again. But this time, there was no bitterness in his tone, only a kind of weary acceptance. "It's not," Keanu said. "But simple doesn't mean easy." The man stared at him for a moment, then let out a dry chuckle. "You've got a way with words, you know that? Not exactly what I expected when I came in here." Keanu smiled faintly, his eyes crinkling at the edges. "What did you expect?" "I don't know," the man admitted. "Arrogance, maybe. Indifference. Someone who wouldn't give a damn about a guy like me." Keanu shook his head. "We're all just people," he said. "Trying to figure it out, one day at a time." The simplicity of the statement hung in the air, resonating in a way that words rarely did. The man sat back in his chair, his body language more relaxed than it had been since the moment he stormed into the cafe. He looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the other patrons, many of whom were still sneaking glances in their direction. "You think they're all judging me?" he asked, his voice low. Keanu followed his gaze but shook his head. "I think they're just trying to understand," he said. "We're all carrying something, whether we show it or not." The man nodded slowly, his fingers drumming lightly against the table. "You've given me a lot to think about," he said. "More than I thought I wanted." Keanu smiled again, his expression warm. "Sometimes the things we don't think we want are exactly what we need." The man chuckled, a soft, rueful sound. "You're full of these little nuggets of wisdom, aren't you?" Keanu shrugged lightly, a flicker of humor in his eyes. "I've had some time to think." The two sat in companionable silence for a moment, the tension that had once crackled between them now replaced by something quieter, more reflective. Around them, the cafe began to return to its normal rhythm. The barista moved behind the counter with renewed focus, the clatter of cups and saucers blending into the gentle hum of conversation. Finally, the man pushed back his chair, the legs scraping softly against the floor. He stood, looking down at Keanu with an expression that was difficult to read. Gratitude? Embarrassment? A mix of both? "Thanks," he said, his voice rough but sincere. "For listening? For not brushing me off?" Keanu nodded, his expression kind. "Thank you for sharing." The man hesitated for a moment, then extended his hand. Keanu rose to meet him, clasping it firmly. The handshake lingered just long enough to convey something unspoken, a mutual respect, an acknowledgement of shared humanity. As the man turned to leave, he paused at the door, glancing back over his shoulder. "Maybe I'll try to fix things," he said. "With my kids, with myself. Maybe it's not too late." Keanu's smile was small but genuine. It never is. And with that, the man was gone, the door swinging shut behind him. The cafe exhaled once more, the collective weight of the moment dissipating like steam rising from a forgotten cup of tea. Keanu returned to his seat, his book still lying open on the table, but for the moment, he didn't pick it up. Instead, he gazed out the window, his thoughts far away, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. The door to the cafe swung shut with a soft chime, and the man was gone. For a moment, the space seemed suspended in a fragile stillness, as if the air itself was processing what had just transpired. Then, slowly, life resumed. The hum of conversation returned, but it was softer now, as though touched by an unseen thread of connection. Patrons exchanged glances, some with faint smiles, others with lingering curiosity. Keanu remained seated, his hands resting lightly on the table. He didn't immediately pick up his book, nor did he reach for his coffee. Instead, he let the moment settle around him, his gaze drifting toward the window where the man had disappeared into the streets of Los Angeles. The sunlight outside had taken on a golden hue, painting the pavement in warm tones. A A soft breeze carried with it the faint scent of jasmine from the flower stand down the block. "Hey," a voice broke the quiet spell. Keanu turned to see the barista standing nearby, her tray of mugs balanced expertly on one hand. She hesitated, her expression a mix of admiration and uncertainty. "I just wanted to say, that was something. I've worked here for years, and I've seen people argue over the smallest things, but what you did, how you handled that, it was different." Keanu offered her a small, humble smile. "Thank you. Sometimes people just need to be heard." The barista nodded, her tattooed arms folding across her chest. "Yeah, well, you didn't have to do that. Most people would have just ignored him, or worse, told him off. But you listened." She paused, her gaze softening. "I think that made a difference." "I hope so," Keanu said, his voice quiet but sincere. "Sometimes it's the smallest gestures that mean the most." The barista smiled faintly, then glanced toward the counter where a fresh group of customers had just walked in. "I better get back to work, but thanks for reminding me that people can still surprise you." With that, she turned and walked away, her steps lighter than before. Keanu watched her for a moment, then shifted his attention back to the table. The coffee in his cup had gone cold, but he didn't seem to mind. He lifted it anyway, taking a thoughtful sip as his gaze returned to the window. Across the room, a woman in her 60s approached his table, her kind eyes crinkled at the edges as she smiled. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice warm. "I don't mean to bother you, but I just wanted to say thank you." Keanu tilted his head slightly, his expression curious. "For what?" "For what you did back there," the woman said. "That man? He was hurting. And you saw that. Most people would have just seen anger and walked away, but you gave him something no one else did. Time. You listened." Keanu's lips curved into a modest smile. "It wasn't much," he said, "but maybe it was enough." The woman nodded, her smile growing. "It was more than enough. And I think you reminded all of us in here today that we could all stand to be a little kinder." Keanu's eyes softened. "Kindness doesn't cost much," he said, "but it can make all the difference." The woman's gaze lingered on him for a moment, as though she wanted to say more, but instead she simply nodded and returned to her table. Around them, the cafe buzzed with renewed energy. A young couple nearby exchanged quiet words, their faces lit with thoughtful expressions. A man holding a laptop at another table smiled at the barista as she passed, murmuring a soft "thank you" when she brought him his drink. The ripple effect was subtle but unmistakable. Keanu could see it in the small gestures, the softened expressions, the way strangers began to acknowledge one another. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, but it was enough to change the atmosphere of the room. Keanu finally picked up his book again, turning it over in his hands as though considering whether to dive back into its pages. But before he could, the door to the cafe opened again, and a group of teenagers spilled in, their laughter breaking the quiet rhythm. They ordered loudly at the counter, their energy a stark contrast to the moment of introspection that had just passed. Keanu smiled faintly, watching them for a moment before returning to his book. As he flipped open the pages, a piece of paper fluttered out and landed on the table. It was a small, handwritten note, something he'd jotted down during one of his travels. The words were simple, but they resonated deeply. "Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a battle you cannot see." He stared at the note for a moment, his fingers lightly brushing the edges of the paper. Then, with a quiet resolve, he slipped it back between the pages of his book and closed it. Rising from his seat, he left a generous tip on the table and slung his backpack over one shoulder. The sunlight outside beckoned, its warmth spilling into the cafe through the large windows. Keanu walked toward the door, pausing briefly as he glanced back at the room. The patrons were still engrossed in their own lives, but the energy had shifted. Lighter, more connected, as though the weight of the day had been momentarily lifted. With a final glance, Keanu stepped outside. The late afternoon light bathed the street in gold, and the breeze carried with it a sense of quiet promise. He walked slowly, his thoughts turning over the events of the past hour. He didn't know where the man had gone or what would become of him, but he hoped their conversation had planted a seed. a small, invisible reminder that change was possible, even in the most unexpected moments. And perhaps that was the point. Not grand gestures or sweeping transformations, but the simple human act of listening, of seeing someone, truly seeing them, and offering them the dignity of being heard. As Keanu disappeared down the sunlit street, the cafe behind him buzzed with life, its patrons carrying forward the unspoken lesson of the day. And somewhere, in the heart of Los Angeles, a man walked a little lighter, his anger tempered by the unexpected kindness of a stranger. As Keanu walked down the sunlit street, the events of the past hour played through his mind like scenes from a quiet, poignant film. The man's anger, the raw vulnerability in his words, and the unexpected shift toward understanding, all of it felt significant, even if he might never see the man again. Keanu had long learned that life wasn't always about resolution, but about the moments that opened a door, even just a crack, to something new. The world around him hummed with its usual energy. Cars passed by, their engines creating a low symphony of urban life. Pedestrians moved along the sidewalks, some talking into phones, others lost in thought. Keanu's footsteps were unhurried, his movements reflecting the calm he carried within himself. A soft breeze brushed against him, carrying the faint scent of coffee and jasmine, a lingering reminder of the cafe. He glanced at the people around him, his gaze lingering on a young woman helping an older man load groceries into the trunk of his car. Across the street, a man leaned down to tie a child's shoe, his expression tender. These small acts of care, unnoticed by most, carried the same quiet power as the conversation he'd just had. It was a reminder that empathy wasn't rare. It was everywhere, waiting to be acknowledged. Keanu reached a quiet intersection and paused at the crosswalk. The light changed, and he stepped onto the street, his thoughts circling back to the man's parting words. Maybe it's not too late. He hoped those words were the start of something new, not just for the man, but for everyone who had been in the cafe. It wasn't often that a single moment could ripple outward, touching so many lives, but today had been one of those rare times. He thought of the barista, the older woman who had thanked him, the patrons who had stayed silent but undoubtedly carried the memory of the exchange with them. Their expressions had been a testament to how deeply the moment had resonated. It wasn't just about the man and his pain, it was about how everyone in that room had felt a shared humanity, a realization that everyone carries unseen struggles. Keanu reached the other side of the street and paused in front of a small park. He took a seat on a bench beneath a sprawling oak tree, his book still tucked under his arm. He opened it again, but his eyes didn't settle on the words. Instead, they gazed out at the world around him, a child chasing bubbles, a couple holding hands, an elderly man feeding pigeons. He thought about the note that had fallen from his book earlier. Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a battle you cannot see. It had been a personal mantra, a quiet guide in his life, and today it had taken on new meaning. The encounter with the man in the cafe had reminded him of the profound simplicity of that truth. Kindness didn't require grand gestures or elaborate plans. It just required being present, listening and offering compassion in moments that called for it. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, Keanu finally turned his attention back to his book. He read a few lines, letting the words flow over him like a soothing tide. But even as he immersed himself in the story, a part of him remained connected to the world around him, to the quiet lessons of the day. Somewhere, the man from the cafe was walking his own path, perhaps feeling a little lighter, a little less burdened by the anger that had consumed him. And somewhere else, the patrons of the cafe were sharing their own reflections, their lives subtly changed by what they had witnessed. Keanu didn't need to know the outcomes to feel at peace. He had done what he could, listened, responded with empathy, and offered a moment of connection. That was enough. As the day faded into twilight, Keanu closed his book, stood, and slipped it into his backpack. He began walking again, the soft crunch of gravel beneath his feet blending with the distant sounds of the city. His mind was quiet now, his heart steady. In a world that often felt chaotic and disconnected, he He carried with him the knowledge that small moments of kindness could still create waves of change. And perhaps, he thought, that was all anyone could ask for.